10 ways to reduce the risk of hoovering. The hoover. It is one of the most discussed periods of the narcissistic entanglement. I am referring to it in the traditional sense, namely the 3-post discard escape hoovers, although, as you will be aware from my works, there are many other hoovers throughout the interaction between us and you. There are most likely 2 reasons for the post-disengagement or post-escape hoover being a prime topic of discussion. First, by the time that you have worked out what you are dealing with, you will have already experienced the seduction, devaluation, and disengagement. The post-disengagement, post-escape hoover is what is occupying you now because it may have happened recently, is ongoing, or you anticipate it happening. The second reason that it is a prime topic of discussion is that the possibility of ongoing interaction with us continues to fascinate you, and thus the post-disengagement, post-escape hoover becomes the focus of much of your attention. I have explained in other work that if the initial grand hoover has taken place and failed, this hoover is generated by you seeking to escape, then you will face follow-up hoovers thereafter of a benign and or malign nature. Their catalyst is whether you cause a hoover trigger by entering our spheres of influence through something you have done, spheres 1 to 5, or the fact that you have just entered our mind for some reason, sphere number 6. If you have entered a sphere of influence, there is always a consideration that a hoover could be affected, and that depends upon whether the hoover execution criteria are met. The hoover execution criteria are a number of factors which differ dependent upon when the hoover trigger takes place, and those factors vary in number and applicability. However, understanding what some of those criteria are, and moreover, you exerting control over those criteria, or at least understanding what they are, will go a long way to enabling you to reduce the risk of being hoovered following disengagement or your escape. So, what are the 10 ways that you can look at reducing the risk of being hoovered? Number 1, your whereabouts. If we do not know where to find you so that we can appear face to face and look to garner some excellent proximate fuel by turning up at your home, your work, or somewhere else you frequent, this naturally poses a considerable problem to us. A greater narcissist will apply some effort to ascertaining your whereabouts. A lesser is unlikely to bother at all. Accordingly, as part of building your no-contact defenses, the necessity of changing where you can be physically found not only pays dividends in commencing no contact, but thereafter in affecting the likelihood of a later hoover. Number 2, your accessibility. In a similar vein, we need to be able to contact you to hoover you, for instance, electronically through social media, through a text message or by telephone. If we do not have a physical place to either attend, drive past, leave a note, or send a gift, then we will invariably look to access you through electronic means. If we know your telephone number, we are far, far more likely to hoover. Or if we have a means of contacting you through an app or on social media, we are far, far more likely to hoover. Therefore, you need to effect a media blackout. You need to change your telephone number. You need to block us on social media, and even better, come off social media altogether. And if you manage to do so and sustain this raises the hoover bar and makes the likelihood of a hoover less likely. Number 3, the gullibility of friends and family. We may have a lieutenant in your ranks already. If so, the prospects of being hoovered are increased as we will have them lined up to leak to us where we can find you and how we can contact you. Even if there is no lieutenant, if there is the prospect for a hoover, we, or alternatively a recruited lieutenant, will approach people in your camp to gather this information. It is often done under a separate auspice. There may be an emergency. Some post has arrived that we need to pass on. There is something confidential to relate to you. And if your family and friends have been trusted with contact information with regard to you, their susceptibility and likelihood of releasing this information is crucial. Bear in mind, several months may have passed, and if a lieutenant approaches your parents or a friend they may not be alert to what this is, namely the gathering of information to allow us to then hoover you. If those who have your contact information remain impregnable, then you are cutting off a further conduit and maintaining your no contact defense. Accordingly, consider very carefully who you provide information about your whereabouts, your telephone number, email address to, and also consider the risk that that may be passed on. Number 4, happy and contented. If you are demonstrating, to the outside world at least, that you are happy and contented, then this will affect the likelihood of a hoover. Generally speaking, we expect you to still be pining for us and miserable. This is regarded as a condition which is fertile ground for a successful hoover. If we are aware that you are moving forward, that you rarely mention us, that you appear generally happy and content, then the lesser and mid-range of our kind will be less likely to attempt to hoover. This is because your contentment infuriates us, but also because if you are contented, you are more likely to rebuff the approaches. And even though you may do so in a pleasant way, the fuel gained will be nil or minimal. You should be aware, however, that a greater will regard you as a prospect to break, and therefore a greater is far less likely to be dissuaded by seeing you happy and content alone. Number 5, a new interest. If you happen to have moved on to somebody new, which of course is dependent on the passage of time and other factors, then again, a lesser or a mid-range narcissist is less likely to hoover. This is because there is an increased prospect of being rebuffed and thus wounded, and this will prove too great a risk to the lesser or mid-range. Having been wounded already by knowing that you are with somebody new, then a lesser or mid-range are likely to regard the hoover as too risky. They want you to be holding a torch for them, pining for them, and therefore there is the prospect of no fuel and further wounding. This, again, however, does not apply to the greater narcissist. We are more likely to apply a malign follow-up hoover and lash out at you and your new partner in order to cause trouble between you and to draw fuel from two sources. Number 6, your fuel potential. You will have been an excellent source of fuel at some point. That is why you were chosen and ensnared, but then that changed. The reason hoover fuel is so potent is that you will have recovered to some extent from what has happened to you. You will want to see us or be relieved that we have come back for you. Not always, but often. And most of all, the fact that we have abused you and yet we can still entice you either to start the formal relationship again or even just to provide fuel in a one-off hit shows how powerful we are and thus adds to the potency of the fuel. If you are a super empath or a codependent, you will be a prime prospect for hoovering. However, if we regard you as still badly crippled by what we did to you, so that you have been in effect numbed, so that your emotional output is muted or deadened, this will affect the hoover taking place. In such circumstances, a proxy hoover may take place so a lieutenant can scope you out, or you may, if circumstances allow, receive a paving the way message, which is a hoover, but effectively is a way of seeing how the land lies to then decide whether more extensive hoovering should take place. Number 7, your knowledge. If we are aware that you know what we are or have information which could be damaging to us in the form of amounting to a serious exposure, this will lessen the likelihood of a hoover. Whilst a lesser or mid-range narcissist has no awareness of what they are, if with a lesser you do know what they are and you keep making mention of it and adapting your behaviour accordingly, he or she will at least recognise instinctively there is little fuel to be gained and there is a risk of wounding. Similarly, a mid-range will realise that there is something off with the situation and will think very carefully before being exposed to less fuel and or wounding. The greater is not concerned so much by your knowledge of what he is. He will deny it and look to manipulate the situation to his advantage to draw further fuel. But he will be concerned by anything that could cause wounding or exposure on a larger scale. Number 8, the facade. This carefully constructed and maintained device, which we use to repeat a defect against you, is important. Not only do we use it against you, but it will be used against other victims, and those who help create the facade provide us with fuel. We do not want this to be damaged or fractured in any way. If we ascertain that there is a risk of this happening if we hoover you, for instance, you have damning evidence of our behaviour which could be circulated if we engage with you, then we will not want the facade damaged by such exposure, and accordingly the prospect of a hoover happening will be diminished. Number 9, energy levels. If you enter our sphere of influence when energy levels are lower as a consequence of lower fuel provision, then the hoover may be regarded as not worth the effort. If, however, there is easy accessibility and the prospect of fuel gain is considered to be significant, then even low energy levels would not be a dissuading factor. But if there are other factors as above in place which would prove difficult, then when we have low energy levels, this makes us less inclined to want to perform the hoover. This situation may arise where we're still embedding a new primary source after your escape, or we may not have one yet. We're reliant on fuel from secondary sources. If the hoover is perceived as having hurdles and energy levels are low, even though you may have entered a sphere of influence and caused a hoover trigger, the criteria may well not be met and will cause us to look elsewhere for fuel and not engage in hoovering you. Number 10, the type of narcissist. The particular school of narcissist that we are has a bearing also. The lesser will be looking for easy gains, low-hanging fruit and immediate results. The immediacy is important. Lacking the calculation of the mid-range, upper mid-range and greater, the lesser will be inclined to hoover if you are in near reach, even if there are other sources, because he's unable to control his thirst for hoover fuel. He will, however, risk being rebuffed, and this will in turn ignite his fury, causing him to lash out at you with potential repercussions. If the lesser does not see an immediate opportunity, he will move on. He is akin to an opportunist burglar. The mid-range will put a little more effort and planning in, but will be cautious in his approach, mindful of the potential repercussions, and therefore a few hurdles will indeed put him or her off. He or she may apply a little effort to consideration, but it does not take too much to cause him to move on. The greater will need considerable hurdles to prevent a hoover happening when a sphere of influence has been penetrated and a hoover trigger has occurred. If the greater knows that there is very potent hoover fuel, he will apply considerable effort, like a well-planned heist, to get to those jewels.